Thank you. It is about 12:01. I'm starting to admit people from the waiting room. So we are just going to wait one more minute and then we'll start with introductions and we'll have Dr. Wexler with her fabulous presentation. So please just wait one more minute.
Oh, Courtney, can you give me sharing permission? I don't know if I have
Oh,
yet.
yes. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay, you should be good to go there. All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending our February Lunch and Learn. It is Wednesday, February 11th at 12 o'clock. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I am Dr. Courtney Overton. I am a speech language pathologist, and I'm also the Associate Education Director for Mile. One of my responsibilities is to conduct Lunch and Learn. So we do have our Lunch and Learn series for the semester. Every month, we'll be hosting lots of different speakers. We have one every month through May, so you'll be hearing more about it as well. So today we have Dr. Jade Wexler, who is a professor of special education here at the University of Maryland, College Park. And she currently serves as the area director of special education at the University of Maryland, working closely with MILE, the Maryland Initiative for Literacy and Equity. As a former high school special education English and reading special education teacher in Maryland, Dr. Wexler aims to bring her practical experience in the field to her research. With the focus on bridging research to practice, she also greatly values the partnerships she's formed with school district administrators and teachers. Dr. Wexler also values the inclusion of her students in designing and implementing research. So today she will be presenting on evidence and lessons learned from a secondary school-wide literacy model approach. So I am going to turn it over to Dr. Wexler and continue to admit people from the waiting room. We will have a few minutes at the end for questions. So please continue to place your questions and comments in the chat. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Courtney, and thanks for having me. It's great to see you all, and I'm always excited to see people interested in adolescent literacy. I have way too many slides and too much to talk about, so I'm going to move quickly through some things. I'm not as good at monitoring the chat, so if there's a burning question, maybe Courtney or someone can interrupt me, but I'll try to figure things out so we have some time at the end. But let me see if I can share this. Okay, there we go. Oh, okay, and then let me turn it in slideshow mode. Sorry about this. Okay, so as Courtney mentioned, I'm a professor of special education here at University of Maryland, and a PI of several federally funded grants, and you're going to hear all about those today. Um, okay, so I always want to start with my acknowledgments. Of course, the U.S. Department of Education, Institute for Education Sciences, and the Office of Special Ed Programs, which has funded much of this work you'll hear about. Always could not do any of this without our school partners and my partners who are typically at the University of Texas at Austin Meadows Center for Preventing Educational Risk. So, what I'm going to do today is start by giving you a little background, really talking about what is this need for school-wide literacy models at the secondary level, and then through a story of this line of work over the last, oh gosh, 15, 20 years or so, I'm going to kind of give you some highlights of things that we've learned and ways we've really adapted, really in response to working with our school partners. And then at the end, I'll touch on some of the evidence that we've built in terms of the literacy practices and the coaching model that we've developed. I'll talk about resources and then some next steps that we are working on right now. So again, what this presentation is and what it's not, again, it's going to be a story of lessons learned. It's going to be an overview of these practices and resources, just kind of an opportunity to start to get you to think about things and reflect about your own schools or districts, implementation of school-wide literacy models. It's not a detailed PD session. Obviously, we don't have enough time for that. I'm not going to get in the weeds on how to do all of these practices. If you're really interested, we have some modules and all sorts of resources up on our aimcoaching.org site. And just a note that as part of a new project that we have, we are really going to be revising a lot of that and developing and adding more resources up there. I also go frequently to different districts and present on the actual practices. And then there's some other resources on the meadowcenter.org website. Okay, so probably don't have to tell most of you what the reality is these days of reading for secondary students, but these are NAEP data, the most recent data that we have. So the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And as you know, that's given every 2 years to a representative sample of students across the nation. And it really helps us kind of get the pulse of reading achievement on what's happening. So what you can see here is that in 2024, 70% of our eighth graders were not performing at the proficient level of mastery, and 33% are not at the basic level. So to perform at the proficient level, you have to do some pretty basic things. Kids have to be able to locate information in a text, identify what the main idea is. Making inferences is really tricky for our students. And of course, vocabulary and complex text can be really challenging. So with 70% of our students considered to be developing readers, if you think about a typical tier 1 content area classroom, that's about 25 students. That's about 17 of those students who are potentially still struggling with reading and understanding text. And so what that does is create this flipped triangle. And so we know that in a typical 3-tier model, 80% or more of students should be okay in a good tier 1 situation. But what we have here are these flip triangles where 80% or more of students are really struggling and in need of supplemental intensive intervention, but typically schools are unable to provide that type of intervention to that many students. Implications being we really need to think about strengthening the tier 1 setting where most of our students spend a majority of their instructional day. So, whoops, trying to advance this slide. Oh my goodness, now it's going crazy. Okay, so we still have this need to be able to really read and have students comprehend complex text to acquire content knowledge, which is the name of the game. And unfortunately, we have teachers who might look a little bit like this in some of these classrooms. And a lot of this is on us. It's on higher ed. How are we preparing these teachers and how are we providing them continued professional learning opportunities? Many of them weren't necessarily prepared to be reading teachers, right? I'm a science teacher. I'm not a reading teacher. How do I integrate these evidence-based reading practices into my typical content area setting? And so over on the left, you can see that there have been a number of observation studies done nationally that are showing that many of our tier 1 content area teachers are really missing opportunities to integrate that type of instruction into their content area instruction. And so what you get is something like this, right? Where you have the teachers a little stressed out. They need to get through all this complex content and you have the kids all stressed out, and that's not really a good thing. However, every morning we know that these kids still show up. And so we want to work on how we can help schools build this integrated literacy and knowledge building approach. And you've heard a lot about this in the media over the past couple of years, right? So at the elementary level, we're really working with teachers on taking coherent and cumulative content and really building that into that English language arts block, leading to content-rich English language arts curriculum, and then kids having the literacy skills and knowledge base needed for comprehension and content acquisition. And the same outcome is true at the secondary level, but it looks slightly different where they have their coherent presumably, and cumulative, presumably, content, which is their curriculum. And what we need to really work with these teachers on is how to integrate a set of evidence-based comprehension building practices into that tier one setting. And then, of course, we need to build more intensive support into any supplemental intervention settings, leading to that integrated literacy and knowledge building approach. So if you think about it, sorry, there's a little delay here. If you think about it, um, from the point of view of this student, what we have here is one student, and if this student got at least one science class a week that they're going to, one period where the science teacher has infused some comprehension building practices, at least one in social studies, and at least one in English language arts. And let's stop there, right? That's a pretty healthy dosage of literacy instruction that this student is getting, and it's not all falling on that one teacher. And maybe this is a student who also happens to be getting one of those reading or special education intervention blocks. And he's also getting 5 periods a day of more reading. Again, that's a healthy dosage. Having it not fall on one teacher is also important for generalization of the practices so that the student doesn't just go to one class and learn a strategy. And then let's say they go to English and they teach them how to get the gist, how to get the main idea. And I always use this example. And then they go to social studies, and the social studies teacher is essentially telling them, hey, read this and tell me the main idea. Does that student naturally say, oh, well, I learned this great strategy in my English class. I think I'll go ahead and apply this in social studies? Not typically, right? So we need all these teachers to know a simple set of strategies. It doesn't have to replace all the discipline specific things that they're doing, but something that can be aligned horizontally across the tier one um, setting. So, what are these practices that work? Luckily, we've built up some knowledge over the last several decades about what does work for the secondary level. One trusted resource we can go to are the adolescent literacy practice guides, which you know are um, put out by the Institute of Education Sciences. And what they do is they synthesize the literature on a topic. In our case, this was one from 2008, and they come out with recommendations for practitioners based on strong or moderate evidence. And so what you can see here is we should be providing explicit vocabulary instruction in all of their classes, explicit comprehension strategy instruction, lots of opportunities for kids to work on extended discussion, text meaning, interpretation. Of course, we always want to think about their motivation. One thing I always tell teachers is one of the best ways to engage kids and motivate them is good instruction, good data-based instruction that's not too far above their heads, not too, far below, but meeting them where they need to be met. And then, of course, some of our kids need those intensive interventions. We also know that these practices need to be delivered with explicit instruction. So lots of that I do, we do, we do, we do, we do. We're going to keep doing it together with that guided practice. I'm going to be looking at my data and I want to know how are these students doing? And when I look at the data and it doesn't look so hot, I want to think about what is it about my instruction that needs to change? Not, oh, why does this student not understand this? But what is it that I need to go back to and remodel for the students? Students need lots of opportunities to respond and practice. I'm saying this all the time. They need immediate corrective feedback. So peer mediated instruction is something that we really bake into our practices. This quote, I show it all the time. It's my favorite quote from a student I worked with in a juvenile correctional setting when he said, I don't know, they always tell us, so my teachers always tell us to get the main idea, but no one ever shows us, like, how do you actually get the main idea? And what he's pointing to right there is this need for explicit instruction and modeling. Okay. In 2022, there was another adolescent literacy guide that focused on reading interventions for students in grades 4 through 9. And I just want to point out that the recommendations that we came out with, and I was actually honored to be on this panel, is they overlap with the recommendations in some ways for the for tier one in that 2008 guide. So you can see there on the bottom that in the intervention, kids should also be using a set of comprehension building practices and doing that with something called stretch text. So text that's a little bit above where they're at, using that, guided practice, of course, lots of modeling. And then these kids should also, of course, be working on their decoding skills and fluency skills. So alignment is something that we really need to start thinking about at the secondary level. And I'm really excited about a new project that we have with Montgomery County where we are going to be doing just that. Thinking about a set of practices that can be aligned horizontally across the tier one setting, as well as vertically throughout any intervention settings. These practices should be aligned in terms of the practices themselves, and I'll show you a set that you could think about using for that. The language being used should be the same, the sequencing that they're used, and the materials, okay? And a lot of what this does is reduce cognitive load for kids going to a million different classes and hearing about all these different strategies that they can use. So it might look like this, where we take a set of evidence-based comprehension building practices like PAC Plus, which I'm going to show you, and all the teachers in tier one are able to do them, as well as the intervention setting, maybe in a more intensive way, right? The language being used when implementing those practices can be the same. The materials can be the same or adapted. And the sequencing can be thought about and communicated. So perhaps there's a topic being covered in that tier one setting in science on some hard topic in science, and maybe the tier two teacher takes the same text or the same topic and they have their kids read and use those same strategies in the tier two or three setting, so that there's sort of a review or a preview of topics and texts and literacy strategies that are being aligned across those settings. And that can really help kids with increasing that dosage of literacy instruction and intervention that they're getting, leading to that integrated literacy and knowledge building approach. Okay, so I know I'm moving really fast. I want to kind of get to the meat of the story that I want to tell you. I am not monitoring the chat, so if things are coming up that you really want to know, again, just unmute yourself, but I will just keep going. Okay, so I'm going to explain this story, and there was a couple different phases of work, as you can see there, funded by different funders. The first was PACT, and PACT stands for Promoting Adolescents' Comprehension of Text. And this grant was a giant IES Reading for Understanding grant that went to Dr. Sharon Vaughn and others at the University of Texas at Austin. And what they did is they developed these practices and implemented them primarily in US history, eighth grade. And this was a unit-based approach. Okay, so they were taking intact, usually 2-week units for US history and integrating these literacy practices. And you can see them on the bottom there. They would build background knowledge, comprehension canopy on the unit. They would do a series of essential words routines to teach kids different words or concepts that they needed to understand to help enhance comprehension and content knowledge about that content. And then I engaged in critical reading, which kids would read through a text, they would stop at certain points, and they would engage in text-based discussion, which aligns with that IES practice guide. And then there was a team-based learning component. So this is really a content approach to comprehension. And what that kind of means is it's really characterizing written content as this vehicle for instruction. So it engages students in building these coherent representations of the ideas that are presented in print. We often refer to this as the construction integration model, which operationalizes this approach. And really what students are doing is they're integrating their background knowledge and units of information from a text, and that helps facilitate meaning making as they progress through the text. And a lot of instructionally, this includes a lot of discourse about the text. So I just want to highlight, and I'll show you a little more later, but what it might look like is providing some background knowledge on the topic, then the essential words. And then this is just an excerpt from one of the critical reading routines where you can see that kids will read through part of the text, they stop, and they engage in these kind of higher level questions with text-based discussion. Okay, they build their meaning making as they go along. So, PACT was tested in several rigorous randomized control trials. And you can see this was the first one in 2013. Kids in classrooms, the US history classrooms where the PACT literacy strategies were infused in, were compared to students in business as usual classrooms. They got the same content, but they did not get those literacy practices. And what you can see is that kids in the PACT classrooms outperformed kids in the business as usual classrooms on measures of content knowledge, content area reading comprehension, and general reading comprehension. I just switched the slide. This was replicated in 2015. If you look at the pattern for students with disabilities, it holds English learners with disabilities. And this was a PACT effectiveness study where researchers were a little bit more hands off. So the pattern there is the same. These practices have a lot of evidence behind them. Okay, so fast forward a couple years, I'm talking to Sharon Vaughn and my co-PI Elizabeth Swanson at UT, and we're saying this is great, but how can we extend these practices beyond social studies? We've got that flip triangle. We want to increase the dosage of literacy instruction that these kids are getting across that tier one setting and build the school-wide models. So we were funded at a subsequent grant from the Office of Special Ed Programs, and this was a model demonstration grant, very different type of work. What we first did is we took those practices and we slightly adapted them so that now they could be content and curriculum agnostic. It was text-based. So we asked teachers to implement them anytime that they were going to already teach a text, have kids read a text, like an expository text in their classroom, or to get some text to read that aligned with their topics. They did comprehension canopy. They built background knowledge on the text, essential words instruction, and they followed a certain routine. And then they did that same critical reading routine. We did that in 4 schools in the DC area. And after several years, we had a lot of different pockets of implementation. We went back and we interviewed teachers and administrators about their perceptions of different things related to this project, if they were sustaining teachers or administrators. And a couple themes came out. So, first, they said, we sustain the use of these practices because they were simple. I could do them. They were routine like, they were easy to implement, and you allowed for some customization. So I could implement them in science, I could implement them in social studies. The teachers all said that they could, it was feasible. The students, they said the practices were beneficial. They perceived that they were beneficial. The data show that they were beneficial. One thing that a lot of them commented on is that some of them would have benefited from some more intensive, explicit instruction, especially when it came to answering those critical reading questions. When they got to the critical reading questions, a lot of the kids really struggled with being able to answer them. And then at the school support level in this project, we as the researchers were the coaches. And so what they said was the administrators really prioritized and ensured effectiveness. And the coaching that was given was helpful, but it really wasn't enough or systematic enough to address teachers' varying skill and will needs. So we had pockets of implementation, but not everybody was implementing. So we really wanted to focus on that. We wanted to focus on this idea of how do we intensify these practices for kids who need it. And we really like this idea of allowing for customization, making sure that the practices allowed for enough feasibility, flexibility, while maintaining the active ingredients that we know were effective. Okay. So we first started thinking about this coaching model. We knew that these teachers had this ongoing need. We knew they needed more support in how to implement these practices. But we also knew that our instructional coaches were really stretched thin. And so we wanted to try to develop a coaching model that tailored activities to teachers' needs in a way that would really maximize the coaching time. Those coaches were wearing a million different hats if any of these schools had coaches, right? So after a couple years, a couple tries, we were funded for another study. This was an Institute of Education Sciences development grant, and the goal in this grant is to develop an intervention and then test it in a pilot study to show its promise so that we can move forward eventually to a more full-blown randomized controlled trial or rigorous study. So in good old 2020, we were funded for this study to develop AIM coaching, and AIM stands for Adaptive Intervention Model Coaching. The first thing we needed to do was think about our PACT plus practices. We wanted to make a more intensive option in them, and these were the practices that this coaching model was being linked to. Okay, so we decided that we wanted to integrate Get the Gist. And many of you are probably familiar with Get the Gist, right? An evidence-based way to teach kids how to get the main idea. So what we did is we added that into the critical reading component. Instead of stopping and getting and answering the comprehension questions, they would stop and get the gist. So we integrated this strategy approach. We made it very explicit. You can see the steps are right here on the left. Who or what is the section about? What's the most important information about the who or what? And then they write a gist statement. So we also came up with these gist pointers. So how do you know who or what the section is mostly about? Well, is there anything or anyone mentioned most frequently in the section? Did you check pronouns? And of course, we need to do lots of mini lessons on that. Pictures, caption, what is giving us a clue about who or what this section is about? Once they identify that, they go to what is the most important information about that who or what. And you can see that we had just pointers for each of those steps. So the first thing teachers would do is they would do comprehension canopy. Okay. So they would provide background knowledge. They would introduce the topic of the text. You may already know a great deal about plants. You may already know that they need water and sunlight to gather nutrients to grow. The process that plants use to transfer water and sunlight into nutrients is called photosynthesis. What's it called? Photosynthesis. Good. All right. And then we would do these springboard images and we would show them these different images. We would talk about them being a little bit different. And then we would have usually a turn and talk to have them discuss the springboard images. We're essentially trying to give them a little bit of that instructional Velcro before they're about to read something that's probably pretty complicated, right? And we also want it to be a hook, get them interested. So pretty easy. We keep this short, about 5 minutes. Then we would go through an essential words routine where we picked a word or concepts, and you'll see multiple different concepts from the reading snuck into this routine where we, excuse me, teach them the word. We go through images if it makes sense to do that, that represent the word, related words, example usage, examples and non-examples, and they do one more turn and talk. Again, the non-negotiable is that they need to keep this short. And why do we want comprehension canopy and essential words short? Because we want their eyes on the text. We want to increase the time that kids have eyes on text with co-occurring literacy instruction. And then they would give them a culminating question that we want them to, a culminating question that we want them to answer at the end of critical reading. And the one for this text on Venus flytraps is how and why has the Venus flytrap developed specifically for its surroundings? Okay. And for the first section of the text, the teacher goes through and they annotate and do a think aloud using those gist pointers. So I'm going to go through and read this, and I am going to circle words, right, or phrases of things that go with my gist pointers. And my first gist pointer is, was there anything mentioned most frequently? Think about pronouns, right? So the Venus flytrap is an insect-eating plant that lives mostly on the East Coast. I'm going to circle Venus flytrap because I know the title of this text is the Venus flytrap. Okay, found primarily in swampy parts of the United States, like North and South Carolina, the Venus flytrap. Oh, there it is again. I'm going to circle it. Has colorful pink and green hues. Like most other plants, Venus flytraps, circle, get some nutrients from the soil. But since swampy areas tend to have soil that's nutrient poor, it's hard for the plant. Oh, the plant. That's talking about Venus flytraps. I'm going to go ahead and circle it, and I'm going to draw an arrow so that I remember that that's referring to Venus flytrap. So as you can see, I won't do the whole thing, but you keep going through it. You talk about pronouns, and eventually you talk about, well, who or what was circled the most? I think it's the Venus flytrap. So I would write that on my graphic organizer. So the teacher models that. Then they go through the next step. Now that they know the who or what, we need to know the most important information about the who or what. What relates to the comprehension canopy? What relates to the essential words? And the teacher goes through and does a think aloud to model how to jot down some notes about the most important information, and then eventually how to put that information together to come up with the gist statement. So this is a strategy approach, and it's very, very explicit. Okay. And that's how we adapted critical reading for these teachers who said we needed a much more intensive option. We also thought about this idea of allowing for customization. What are the negotiables and non-negotiables of these practices? The teachers wanted us to be really clear with them. In fact, they would come to us and they would say, is it okay if I do it this way? But what if I want to do it this way? And it really forced the researchers to think about what are the active ingredients of these practices. We know fidelity matters. This is a study from that one of those first PACT studies where they looked at the relationship between fidelity and students' content knowledge. And you can see when fidelity of the practices was low, students' content knowledge outcomes were low. When it was high, students' content knowledge outcomes were high, right? Fidelity matters. But sometimes there's a struggle between fidelity and students' needs. And we have teachers who will say, yeah, but this doesn't work this way in my classroom for my students, right? And it gives fidelity sometimes a little bit of a bad rap. So we really tried to keep that in mind. And we also thought about practitioners, sometimes the way that they perceive and implement an intervention really gives us this valuable insight. In fact, all the time, it gives us this valuable insight, and some of their adaptations may increase the efficacy of the intervention altogether. So we really thought about it. How can we think about fidelity while factoring students' needs? And we gave the teachers some negotiables. These are some examples. For example, you can implement a packed lesson. This is a critical reading text that has like 4 sections. You can implement it all in one period, okay? Or if you're a science teacher and you have a lab that you need to do that week, you really could implement it split across a week. That's one way that we gave them some flexibility. Then we thought about the negotiables and non-negotiables of each of the PAC Plus practices. So you can see, for example, a non-negotiable for comprehension canopy, provide background information that's necessary to comprehend the text and keep it short. But you can do that in different ways. You can do it with the image that I showed you, or you can, do something else, as long as you keep it short. And the big thing that we started thinking about was critical reading. We started thinking some kids need this very explicit, intensive way of doing critical reading. Some of them don't. So maybe we need to come up with this thing that we call the explicit instruction continuum. We now tell teachers to start with this strategy approach, a very explicit way of doing get the gist and coming up with the main idea of each section. But we don't want them to stop there. Also, the kids will like revolt, right? They don't want to do that all the time. How do we move them into and back to that content approach that we started with? Being able to answer these higher level comprehension questions. This is in a paper that's coming out soon in teaching exceptional children. But what you can see here is first, we want teachers to do this very overt use of get the gist with gist pointers, like I kind of modeled. Lots of explicit instruction, lots of thinking aloud. But then fade that. Kids should be able to do some of that in their head. And they could even drop the graphic organizer. And eventually, they're going to move to that content approach where they don't have to do get the gist anymore. Now they can do comprehension questions instead. And maybe at the beginning, those comprehension questions are kind of lower order literal questions. And then we move them more towards this higher order questions with lots of modeling. We also know we can do lots of modeling to peer mediated practice and lower levels of support. So oops, there's my animations. We've worked that into our model. About 6 weeks in now, we tell teachers to start a peer-mediated routine. of doing critical reading. We give them a partner reading cue card. We teach the kids how to read through each section, stop, and get the gist together. And then eventually they move into that content approach, and we still model for them. We still teach them how to answer these comprehension questions. But now we teach them to really think about what is the knowledge that I have from my prior knowledge, maybe from comprehension canopy and essential words, to what did I just learn from this section of text, to how can I use both of those things? And again, this is that construction integration model. How can I use that to respond to these comprehension questions, even when they're higher level comprehension questions? And we also give them a partner reading routine that they can do that with, and they stop and discuss. How do you know when and how to move along that explicit instruction continuum? Some classrooms are going to start over here with critical reading with Get the Gist very explicitly with gist pointers and graphic organizers. Maybe a couple weeks in, they're going to be able to drop the use of the gist pointers in such an overt, explicit way. And then eventually, maybe a couple months in to the year, they're going to drop the use of the graphic organizer. They're just going to talk about what the gist is, right? And then eventually they're going to move on down that continuum to peer mediated critical reading and then critical reading with comprehension questions. We teach our teachers in our projects to use data to make these decisions. I'm not going to go through all that today because I don't have time, but you can get the gist of how you do that. Other classrooms might do critical reading with Get the Gist and gist pointers and graphic organizers, but pretty quickly they can move into that peer mediated critical reading with Get the Gist. Maybe they stay in that for quite a long time before their teachers think they're ready to move down the continuum. So it really varies, but we're trying to work with our teachers on how to use data to make decisions about what's appropriate for different types of classrooms. Okay, I'm moving through here. I'm almost done, but the next thing, which is what we were actually funded to do in 2020, was to build that coaching model. We have the practices set now, right? We know what we want to teach these teachers to do. We know their evidence base based on the prior work that we've done, but we want to build this coaching model. We knew based on a national survey, this was led by Alex Shelton, who's at Johns Hopkins University now, who used to work on our team at Maryland. And this was this national survey where we saw that, gosh, a lot of our secondary teachers don't even have literacy coaches. And the buildings that they're working in are quite large. So lots of students in the school, which means lots of teachers to coach. And so we asked the coaches nationally, what inhibits your ability to coach, if there is a coach, right? Well, they have time constraints. They wear so many hats, too many teachers to coach. How do I go about coaching these teachers? And they needed additional professional development on how to coach. They weren't given a guidebook on what to do. So we, again, were funded to do just that, come up with a systematic, adaptive model, a model that also built in customization so that it was feasible for schools to implement so that they could support teachers as they implemented the PAC Plus practices. AIM coaching is data-based. It teaches coaches how to use teachers' skill levels, their fidelity, and their will. Okay, how much do they want to implement these practices? Lots of different reasons for that varying. To guide their coaching decisions, it's systematic, so we have guidelines, and it's efficient. It helps the coaches really direct their time, use data to drive their support of teachers, just like we want teachers to drive their support of kids. So during development, we faced a ton of barriers. First one was there were no coaches. So we had to get schools to really kind of reallocate some of their personnel's time. Coaching across content areas was really hard. You know, certain coaches didn't have the science knowledge or whatnot to really be able to guide those science teachers or the social studies teachers. And these coaches didn't always have the greatest literacy knowledge. So some of our solutions, we allowed for a team of coaches in some buildings. We had coaching PLC sessions and developed all sorts of materials and things to support them. And we reinforced with lots of learning opportunities for the coaches. So in a nutshell, here's the model. Looks complicated. I'll walk you through it really quickly. We provide professional development to the teachers on the PAC Plus practices. And then stage one starts. And this is essentially RTI, right? The teachers on a coach's caseload receive standardized protocol support. They get one planning session, and a lot of times that's during an already scheduled PLC meeting, an in-class support session. They get a reflect session. At the end of 6 weeks, the coach does a formal fidelity check of each teacher. And each week they collect what we call collaborative effort data, which is a proxy for will. How willing are they to work with the coach? How willing are they to implement the practices? They have a lot on their plate. So we want to look at that systematically. Then during the progress monitoring stage, the teachers who have high skill, we kind of assume they have high will. Teachers who have low skill, we look more carefully at the will data. Do they have low skill, but they have high will? Like they're trying and they're just not quite there yet. Or do they have low skill and lower will? And for plenty of legit reasons, we see that a lot, right? And then we have a whole guidebook on what types of interventions the coaches can use for these different types of teachers for the next 6 weeks. And then this cycle, progress monitoring on stage two, repeats throughout the end of the year. The whole idea is kind of like dropout prevention, right? You think about it, all these teachers need to be engaged in the school-wide literacy model implementation. If they're not, the people who will suffer will be the kids. Because if they go to one teacher during their day, who has high skill, high will, and another teacher who has low skill, low will, or another couple teachers, the dosage of that student is really going to suffer compared to the dosage of another student who might have all high skill, high will teachers and whatnot. So this is our coaching model. All right. I'm just going to review a couple findings and then I will have time for questions. So we tested this AIM coaching model. We wanted to know if it had promise, okay? And so we did a randomized control trial. We had 7 schools. We randomized by school. We focused only on sixth grade for the study. You can see we had 39 teachers. So we had 3 schools in treatment, and these schools got PACT Plus and AIM coaching. So they were implementing both things. And the comparison group got PACT Plus also, but they just did business as usual coaching, whatever it is they would normally do. The reason we gave both conditions PACT Plus is we really wanted to see, we wanted to isolate the effect of the coaching model. Okay. So just a couple findings to highlight. For our AIM coaches, we looked at their fidelity. Could the AIM coaches implement the coaching model with fidelity? And you can see that in the first coaching cycle, they had pretty good fidelity. Okay. But after that, for progress monitoring and stage two, it kind of dropped off. And we have a lot of reasons for that. But the main one being they just got a lot of things put on them. These coaches were school-based coaches. It was not the research team. So they got a lot of things that were put on them. But we know it's pretty feasible. The other thing we thought was interesting is we surveyed coaches in the treatment group and the business as usual group. And you can see here that the coaches, all coaches reported some of the similar practices, but the AIM coaches really reported doing something above and beyond just plan, support, reflect. They really reported doing things like analyzing teachers' data, really supporting using that data, and being engaged in other PLC sessions. So we were really happy to see that our treatment coaches were engaged in database decision making. In terms of teacher outcomes from this, and again, this is a cascading model, so we are expecting that effects from the coaching intervention is going to trickle to the teachers, is going to trickle down to students. And it's very difficult to see effects in that type of cascading model. But what you see is that AIM coaching outperformed business as usual on the PACT Plus fidelity. So teachers in who are being supported by AIM coaches outperform those being supported by the typical coaching. And this was statistically significant in the spring. Teachers also did better on content area literacy, instruction, self-efficacy, and collective efficacy. So they felt like I can implement this literacy instruction, and I think my colleagues can implement this. Those were not statistically significant, but they were very high effect sizes. Student outcomes were all in the positive direction. So students in the AIM coaching conditions being, coaches supporting teachers who were teaching this students PAC Plus outperformed students in the business as usual conditions. It was not statistically significant, but we're not surprised for a number of reasons. And then in another project, the OSEP project, this was just a pre-post study where we were giving intensive support to schools on how to implement this model. And then we kind of backed off over time, trying to get it to be more sustainable. Just to show you that we had similar findings that the AIM coaches were able to implement fidelity with moderate to high levels of fidelity. The teachers implemented PAC Plus with moderate levels. And you can see very strong effects here for the students on a distal measure of reading comprehension and a proximal measure of reading comprehension. This was a pre-post design, so it's not as strong as a randomized controlled trial, but we were excited to see that. They also improved on a content area literacy self-efficacy measure. So students also improved in their own self-efficacy when it came to using those literacy practices. And it was exciting that that was to a statistically significant degree for the struggling reader sample. Another data point for evidence here is that we've been working with a lot of schools. And we think that I'm most proud of that, right? Of the scale up and the sustainability of all these schools. We mostly worked with Montgomery County for that IES and OSEP study, and they liked it so much they wanted to scale it up. So the district has now required PAC Plus training district-wide for certain grade levels. We co-implemented the training with them and have been working on them with different modules, creating certain materials. We also have a new project with them I'll show you in a second. Oops, there we are. That's Delegate Jared Solomon came to one of our schools. That's Jackie Lightsey. She's the director of secondary ELA in Montgomery County. These are some of the principals and staff development teacher that we worked really closely with. This is a school, we also had schools in Texas, so this was a rural school that got highlighted for their work in it. We've been working with New York City public schools on these practices as well. This has been picked up in the Hechinger report, the LA Times. We presented it in several other kind of high profile presentations around the DC area. I'm really excited about the Reading League, Planet Word presentation, Education Week. We're really excited that there's some momentum when it comes to implementing these evidence-based practices for our secondary learners. And so resources, again, I want to highlight our website, knowing that we are going to be adding a lot more things, and feel free to send me questions if you can't find something. And the next steps, finally, we have a brand new project with Montgomery County. It is a comprehensive literacy state development grant. This is funded by the Office of Elementary and Secondary Ed to MSDE, to Montgomery County. We are super honored that Montgomery County went in on this with us, and we are going to be providing intensive support to 4 more middle schools in the Montgomery County area, and hoping to scale up even more, really creating a model for how to implement these practices, not just across Tier 1, but also aligned in that intervention setting. We had a couple proposals not get reviewed when things got a little wonky with the Department of Ed, but we are hopeful that at some point, maybe they will. I'll just show you this first one is another development project where we teamed up with Dr. Wei Ai, who is at University of Maryland. He's a computer programmer, and we're creating a AI tool that will help teachers select content and plan their PAC Plus lessons more efficiently, and make those database decisions about when to move kids along that explicit instruction continuum. The AI tool will help them make those database decisions with data that they will sort of input. And This is the big one. We had a very large grant proposal in to IES, which is the impact, get it? That's funny. The impact of the AIM package, which would be testing in a full-blown randomized controlled trial, AIM package, meaning the AIM coaching model and the PAC plus practices packaged together versus business as usual in 40 middle schools across the Maryland area. We don't have funding for that yet. The reviews were cut about a year ago, but again, we're hoping that something will change with that. So, big line of work, and I will stop there. I know that was a ton of information, and I'm happy to take questions.
All right, can we just jump in?
Yes, please go ahead and jump in and go ahead and unmute yourself and ask any questions.
Okay. What this I thought about immediately and don't well, I thought about the requirement a long time ago in Maryland that made it was called teaching reading in the content areas. I don't know if
Mhm.
any of you remember that class, yeah. And so it just brought me back to that and actually me remembering going through those courses and looking at the difference between then and now. All right. I could say, yeah, they jumped the gun a little bit, but that's where we were at that time. And so, do you see this possibly, replacing, that? Because I feel like some of the things you're doing here, you're creating a coaching model, things of that nature. That was what was needed at that time. It was a course requirement, and everyone took it. Everyone took it because it was required. And so, do you see this as that? If you, and I don't know if you all have made steps toward that already, with going to the State Department, but if you haven't, or if you have, you know what does that look like? I'm not sure how to form this question, but I think you get where I'm
Yeah. Yeah, I do, and I do remember that literacy across con. I know Jackie Lightsey, at least in Montgomery County, has a big literacy across the content areas initiative, and this is what falls under that. I am really hopeful that we will be able to create a model through this work for the state and beyond. And I know that they're working on the new adolescent literacy policy. And so I think this work really aligns with everything in that policy. And I'm hopeful that, um, yeah, that we can create the model and happy to provide professional development for others. I want to say that, again, this is a set of a certain evidence-based literacy practices. There are certainly others. Um, but I think there is power in having a limited set of them when we're thinking about the school-wide model piece of it. It's kind of like word of the day. Like we don't need a new strategy of the day. That's too much cognitive load for everybody. But if we can do just a couple practices really well across those content areas and aligned in that intervention setting in a more intensive way, that could be really powerful. And it doesn't need to replace other disciplines specific things that need to happen. Certainly doesn't get into writing. I see Dr. De La Paz on here who probably has a lot to say about that. But I think that there's movement and yeah, I'm hopeful that we can contribute to that.
And I just want to say too, I 100% agree with that, having a few practices because it's hard to master a lot. So if you
Yep.
have a few that work, that's great. All right, thank you so
And
much.
I think the explicit instruction continuum that I mentioned is like the most important piece of it because it's really been helping teachers understand those features of effective instruction. And that is all baked into the professional development in here of helping them understand how do I provide good modeling? How do I provide opportunities for kids to respond and get immediate corrective feedback? How do I look at data and know when to kind of intensify more or intensify less? Because we really need to move to meet kids where they need to be met. And so I think just anecdotally, the work with our teachers on that aspect of it has been extremely powerful too, and kind of bleeding into their other instruction. Thank you for that question.
Alrighty, what other questions do you all have?
I'm impressed that I finished on time, and I know I was
Yes.
like going super fast. So someone else asked the question.
I will note that in the chat, Veronica did share two different resources. So if you would like to elaborate on those, just so that our participants know a little bit more about those two.
Do you want me to? So yeah, thank you, Veronica. So she put our website, aimcoaching.org. And again, one of our big priorities in our new project is working with the Meadow Center, who is nicely going to work with us more to add more resources that we're developing them. They're adding them. They're helping us with graphics. We're super excited about that. So there will be more modules up there and other things that align with the revised PD, sample lesson plans, etc. And then the Meadow Center is an amazing resource. If you haven't gone to that website, they're all different things in math and reading and everything. But if you look up Pact Plus, our previous projects landing pages are on there. That project I told you about in DCPS, and we have a number of small videos and other resources on there, just specific to this project. But there are lots of things on the Meadow Center that you all probably be interested in.
Alrighty, thank you. We still have a few more people on. What other questions can we answer for you?
I appreciated your presentation. This is Veronica. I think it's amazing that your work is being expanded across different states, in addition to your ongoing partnership. As kind of the PD expert, were there kind of things that you noticed in terms of like I know you mentioned about customization of the curriculum for the teachers, but from the coach's perspective, whether it's maybe the teaching experience or the school context or classroom characteristics, ways in which maybe like the coaches had to individualize their way of supporting the teachers. And you might have explained that, but I would love to just learn more so I can hopefully learn and adapt to my future
Yeah, that's a
ideas.
great question. Thank you. Yeah, I think the coaching is tough. I think in the model, we don't have as much in there about like how do you build relationships? How do you, that we had some of that, but it wasn't as much focused. And I think that kind of came out organically based on personalities and all that. But I think we need to emphasize that a little more and start to like document what they're doing in different ways with the wills, we have the skill and the will piece is really tricky. We worked with a lot of school-based coaches who had no experience as coaches. And, most of them were still teaching and they were just doing this during a couple periods of the day. That was really, really challenging. And the dynamics of some of that were tough. So I think we need to think about that. It can work, but it's tough. I think something else you mentioned is also a big priority in our new project, which is bringing the administrators on board because setting up that, the school culture, the expectations. So what was it? In some of our findings, our dosage finding, I didn't put them all up there, but dosage in the IES study was okay, but it was pretty even across the board. We think that dosage is maybe more malleable based on administrator expectation than the coaches. So AIM coaching maybe has less of an influence over dosage. When coaches did the AIM coaching and when teachers did PAC Plus, the teachers in the AIM coaching condition, did better, but it didn't really influence dosage as much. And so again, I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that's more of an administrator set the expectation kind of thing. And so we have a training coming up oh gosh, next week, the week after, for all of our administrators in our new project and their whole admin teams. And we're so excited to be getting them all on board and really knowing, because again, this is school-wide system level change. This is not like pecking at these little problems. We have to think bigger, and change the whole system and the expectations. And so that's a big that's a big thing to change, but we're excited. I don't know if that made any sense.
Yeah, it did. I think your work around this cascading model with administrator, coaches, teachers, and like your work around tier alignment is so important. You're just making everything like a very complex process, like in a really tangible. So thanks for all of your work and sharing.
Thank you for your work and being interested.
Alrighty, we have Hannah saying thank you so much. This was fascinating. And also from Susan, amazing program. Have you done any online coaching or is it all in person?
Um, it has mostly been in person. We've given options. Again, we're being customizable and flexible. So we have done some of the like reflect sessions and those things online, but I know there's so much technology now. There's other ways to do things. So totally flexible with that. Whatever works and is feasible, as long as we keep those active ingredients of those non-negotiables in mind of what the coaches need to be doing when they're implementing, I think there could be a lot of flexibility built in.
Thanks, Jade. I'll follow up. This is amazing.
Okay.
So cool. So cool. Thanks so
Susan.
much.
Great to see you. Okay.
We have
Yeah.
Lavonda reiterating, thank you so much. This was great. And Megan as well. This was fantastic. I'd love to chat more. I did some work with WCPS and their routine alignment is a national exemplar. Well done.
Awesome. I'd love to talk to any of you. So please reach out. We are learning from everyone.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. I've been taking notes too. I love the Get the Gist cue card. I'm definitely going to utilize that resource. It's really, really fantastic.
We have
And
a lot on
also,
there that you might want to use in your pre-service classes, and I've redone pre-service classes, and I basically teach them this whole thing throughout the semester, and it's I think very practical, and so maybe thinking about it's all free, it's all usable. If you guys want any help with that, I'm happy to help.
thank you. Thank you. All right. So we are wrapping up here. We've had a fantastic presentation by Dr. Wexler and also some amazing questions. As you can see in the chat, if you'd like to follow up, we do have those resources there. Thanks to Veronica. And you can always shoot Jade an email if you have follow-up questions. And we look forward to seeing you at our next Lunch and Learn, which will be in March 27th. So please save the date and look out for additional information. So thank you very much.